and I'm really delighted to be co-sponsoring the event today with SME4Labour, who community have developed a really good, strong partnership with over the years, and we look forward to continuing that strong working relationship going forward. And I'm really pleased to be chairing today's session, which relates to a sector of our union that's always been the bedrock of our union, which is the steel industry. But it's no secret that it's incredibly challenging times for everybody who's working in the steel industry. And I think that we come together today to celebrate in part the election of a Labour government and look forward to working with a Labour government, but it's fair to say that the mood is very different. It's certainly not one of celebration if you're a steel worker in Port Talbot or Scunthorpe. At Port Talbot, working with the Labour government, we've managed to secure a better deal than the deal that was on the table pre the election with the Tories, which we described as a pretty shoddy deal. And I do want to pay tribute to Jonathan Reynolds and his team and Sarah, because when Labour came in, I think they were given in rugby parlance, as it's in Wales, they were given a hospital pass. It was very difficult with the time that we had to try and negotiate with Tata to secure some of the commitments that we needed to see for future investment in the steel industry. And Jonathan Reynolds and his team, including Sarah, worked very, very hard to try and improve on that deal and secure those investments. But it's certainly not a time for us to be celebrating. We know that very shortly, probably this time next week, number 4 blast furnace will be closing, and we've got workers from Port Talbot with us today who know exactly how difficult this is at the plant and what our members and the workforce are going through at the moment. What makes it all the more frustrating for us as a union is that we know there was a better deal and there was a better plan available. The community and GMB last year put forward a multi-union plan which would have safeguarded Port Talbot steelmaking and secured a just transition for the workforce. The company's decision to reject that plan will go down as one of the worst tragic missed opportunities. And at Scunthorpe, in fairness, the situation is absolutely worse because of the uncertainty that's surrounding the plant. Even at this stage, nobody really knows what the decision is going to be regarding Scunthorpe. The owners are not easy to work with. We've had a number of meetings with them, and in fairness, I don't think we really know what their plan is for the business, even now at this sort of late stage in the day. So we sit here, the outlook for the steel industry is very challenging, but what remains clear though for us, for all of us, is that we need our steel industry. We need it for our national security, sovereignty and our environment. It's a common misconception from our perspective that steel is a problem for the environment or a climate problem, when in fact steel is absolutely vital for any climate solution. The truth is, you cannot build a green economy without a healthy steel industry, whether it's for offshore or onshore wind turbines, electric vehicles, energy efficient buildings, any other form of green infrastructure, public or private sector. Steel is a key component, and there's no reason why we can't and shouldn't be producing that steel here in the UK. We've got an excellent panel with us today, and I think without me saying too much more, we'd like to leave time to listen to the panel's thoughts and views about how we not only can protect, but we can invest and we can grow our steel industry, and then obviously have time at the end for some good questions and answers, hopefully. So I'll hand over at this point, and I think we'll start with Sarah Jones. Sarah is the current Minister of...
Current
Minister. Well,
What do you know?
Well, unless you haven't been told yet, Sarah, you are the current Minister of State for Industry, having served as the Shadow Minister for the same portfolio from 23-24. Sarah's been a great friend of community, and we met with Sarah just a year ago when she met with a delegation of steelworkers here at the conference to listen to the challenges that our members were facing. So, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, and many thanks to community. I think everyone I deal with in politics thinks that community is such an important union, such an important partner, will be such an important player in terms of the steel strategy of the future. So it's a real pleasure to be here. A former Conservative Prime Minister was reported to have said once that manufacturing is a Victorian pursuit best left to the Chinese. And I think the biggest difference between a Conservative government and a Labour government is our approach to industrial strategy and to government's role to try and deliver an industrial strategy that delivers jobs, that delivers skills, that delivers growth, and puts us at the forefront of the kind of global market in the areas where we think we can excel. We have a new politics and a new Labour government, and we will live or die on our ability to improve the economy and to deliver on the 5 missions that we have set out, that Keir Starmer has set out. We know it's a very different world, and Roy has talked about some of the challenges we now face. Security is becoming more central to the government's approach in terms of the socio-economics that Rachel Reeves talks about, and the strategies that we need to consider when you're looking at whether it's China or Russia or Iran, or we are needing to have a more strategic state that does more, that intervenes more, that has more of a role in how industry develops. On steel, I think steel sits at the absolute heart of what this government wants to achieve. It did in opposition, it will in government, because if we can't deliver a vibrant steel sector, we won't grow the economy, we won't transition people in terms of jobs, we won't create the growth across the country that we want to see, and we won't grow the economy. So steel is a sort of the backbone of what our industrial strategy needs to look like. Roy already talked about the challenges that we had when we came into government in terms of Port Talbot and what we were able to do and what we were not able to do. And of course, there is huge frustration that we were not involved in conversations 3, 4, 5 years ago, because we would be in a very different place now if we had been. But as Roy said, we managed to negotiate some improvements on the offer that had been there before. But I don't underestimate the challenge that we have, and the key role that government, that the Welsh Government, the industry need to play to make sure we do right by all of the people who work in Port Talbot and need to be supported. And similarly, as Roy says, the challenges that we are facing in Scunthorpe at the moment are significant, and we are continuing with those conversations to see what can be done. What we are really keen to do is to have a proper steel strategy for the country, which gets us beyond this old mentality of government not stepping in until the very last minute when there's a crisis and something's about to collapse and government has to intervene. We have to get to a point where we're ahead of that cycle, and we make sure we are creating steel in this country. So the Secretary of State, Jonathan Reynolds, has set out his ambition. We're going to have a steel strategy by spring next year, which is ambitious. We will have to move at pace to deliver that. But we are looking at all of the issues around supply chain, around potential DRI and virgin steel, around the different communities in which steel at the moment exists, whether there's opportunities for growth and where those opportunities might be. We have to do that strategy in partnership with industry and in partnership with the unions and in partnership with local communities. And Roy will play an absolutely crucial role, I have no doubt, in the development of that strategy, because we have to do it in a way that looks at jobs, that looks at skills, and that looks at how we get ourselves ahead of this constant cycle of decline where we're firefighting and not investing in the future. We have a fund, 2.5 billion fund on top of the 500 million that was already earmarked for Port Talbot, and we will invest that money. That is a lot of public taxpayers' money. We need to put that in the places that give us the best returns in terms of jobs and skills and security and economic growth, and that is what we will be seeking to do together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I echo what you've said about the steel strategy. We saw previous government started out with an industrial strategy council, and then they dropped that because they realised they didn't have an industrial strategy. So when Jonathan talked about the industrial strategy or picking that up in the new government, absolutely essential. My view, and I did say this to him, is we probably haven't got time to wait for the steel sort of industry, and therefore the steel strategy needs to be accelerated. I'm a great believer in taking the expertise that we have in the country and pooling that together to develop this strategy. No disrespect to the businesses that are here with us, and obviously Gareth represents some of those businesses, is that ultimately they will do what's best for their business, and we've seen that in some of the dealings and negotiations we've had with them. I've always said what we need is a view that what does the country need? What is the demand for steel? What's it going to be in the future for the UK? What are the UK's requirements? And then trying to pool all of our expertise, bring together all of the sort of industry experts into developing this strategy, so that we don't just look at any particular company. We're looking at what we need for our steel industry in the future from the country's perspective. So to me, it's really pleasing, Sarah, to hear you talk about that steel strategy. I think it is ambitious that we'll get it done by the spring, but I think it's essential. We need it, and we need to get working on that ASAP. So with that, I'll introduce Chris. Chris has been a long friend of communities, and he's recently been elected. He's one of the new community MPs in take at Stockton North, taking over from Alex Cunningham, who stepped down. He previously worked in the steel industry, notably as the CEO of the Materials Processing Institute in Teesside. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Roy. So thank you to SME4Labour for putting on this really important event, and of course to community for supporting it as well. Now, as Roy said, I've been spending most of my time for a long time now working in the steel industry. In fact, for quite a while, I ran a business that was one of the members of UK Steel. So I used to work very closely with Gareth, as well as working closely with Roy. And I've worked at all of the major steel sites in the UK. I used to run a facility overseas as well, and I really had the opportunity to contrast the approach of different governments, particularly in Europe, with the approach that our government has taken over the last few decades. And so actually, unfortunately, it's no surprise to me that the steel industry in the UK is in the position it's in, because I've heard successive Conservative governments over the last 14 years talk about how strategically important the steel industry is, but without behaving in a way that recognises that importance. And if you're in any doubt as to how important the steel industry is, you've heard from Roy, you've heard from Sarah as well. But it's even more fundamental than that, really. It's more fundamental than defence. You know, there are 4 things that we require to support human life: air, water, food and steel. And that's not a joke. Each and every one of you consumes a quarter of a tonne of steel every year. And the more people we have in the country, the more steel that we need. You probably don't notice it. It's hidden from your daily life. It's a cheap commodity, and it is because of advances in technology that we've made in the steel industry over so many years. And so it's vitally important for our lives, and so we need to have steel in the UK. And the question is, well, do we need a UK steel industry? Well, of course we do. Every other country in the G20 recognises that, and they take action to achieve it. And I know a lot of people, maybe even some people in this room, think the problem is we can't compete with low-cost economies like China or India. Maybe you're thinking that yourself. But what if I told you that the vast majority of steel imports into the UK don't come from China or India? They come from the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Italy. Surely we can compete with these countries. The UK steel industry is the same size as the steel industry of Belgium, a country with 1/6 the population of the UK. If we did just as well as Belgium, our steel industry would be 6 times bigger than it is now. So I say be more Belgium. I think it's a fairly low level of ambition for us to be just as good as Belgium. I'm not saying even be as good as Germany, France or Italy or Spain, just be as good as Belgium, and we'd see a transformation in our steel industry. So that's how low we've sunk, and the big opportunity for us. But of course there are opportunities for us as well in the communities where we have steel, because steel provides such great jobs too. So again, we heard from Sarah the view, this sort of embedded view that we have in the UK. We have politicians, officials, people in the media who believe, as Sarah put it, that manufacturing is a Victorian endeavour best left to the Chinese. Well, let me tell you, in Stockton North, the place that I represent, people understand the value of manufacturing. They know that manufacturing pays higher wages. In Stockton North, it pays £19,000 a year more than a job in the service industry. They also know the sense of community cohesion that you get, the opportunity for small businesses to form in the supply chain as well. That sense of pride and sense of self-worth that comes from working in the manufacturing industry. So when I hear people saying to me, well, why don't people go and work in high-value services? Well, I can tell you 2 things. One, high-value services jobs do not exist in places like Billingham, Stockton and Norton that I represent. And also, people fundamentally want to get that quality of life, that value that they have from making things and working in the steel industry, and of course we should help them. And the Resolution Foundation produced a great paper a couple of years ago called Stagnation Nation, about how Britain should develop and become more rich and more equal, because we're very unequal and very poor compared with equivalent nations. And fundamentally they pointed at the small size of our manufacturing economy, the big hole that we have in manufacturing in the UK. And no wonder, when manufacturing is only 20% of the economy, but it counts for 50% of our exports. So if we want to generate the wealth in the country to invest in our public services, as we do, then there's one great answer to that, and it's invest more in manufacturing, and steel is the basis of that. So what do we need to do? Well, there are a few things we need to do. We need to decarbonise the industry, and we need to do that for its own sake, because it's the right thing to do, but also because as we decarbonise, as the steel industry is decarbonising, it's going smart at the same time, and it's increasing productivity. So if I told you there's a steel plant in the US that makes the same quality of steel as Port Talbot and the same amount of steel as Port Talbot, but with a 5 times higher productivity, this is the challenge that we have in the UK. So that's why it's so vital that this Labour government is securing that investment in the Port Talbot site, so that we can achieve those levels of productivity there too. So it's really important that we secure that productivity, but it's also important as well that we tackle this issue of perception, because for me the biggest challenge is not investment. There's lots of investment out there. It's not technology, it's not skills. We've got great skilled people who work in the industry in the UK. The biggest challenge we've got is this culture, this perception we have that we've given up, that we can't compete in this sector or in manufacturing more generally. And this fundamentally is the test of our industrial strategy. So you will see in the spring, you will see the first proper industrial strategy this country's had for 40 years. And when you see it, we need you to get out there, support it, hang on to it and drive it forward to help us to do that. Because this is our once in a generation opportunity to shift that culture so that we get a great manufacturing base in the UK that generates wealth, provides great jobs, and fundamentally gives people who live in places like Stockton North a reason to have a really prosperous future as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. You said something there that just got me thinking that maybe we ask the question to Gareth as he's going to speak next, and it is this issue about investment, because if I'm honest, during my probably working career, I've always struggled with trying to convince steel companies to invest in the right areas, and I think we have suffered through a lack of investment, and at sometimes probably maybe a decade or so ago, we clearly weren't even investing depreciation. And as you know, if you're not investing, then that's going to lead you to where we are today, because the plant's going to suffer. It's going to become dated, etc. And I think we have suffered a little bit. Maybe Gareth can pick that up in his speech. When I took over as General Secretary of Community 10 years ago now, seems like yesterday, one of the first people I met was Gareth, because at the time Gareth was in charge of UK Steel, which is representing the employers, and the reason we met was to sort of get to know each other and talk about how we saw things in the industry. And I make no apology for saying this, our views were aligned then. They haven't always been aligned. We've fallen out over the years on a number of issues, but generally the views of the employer are they want successful businesses, and successful businesses mean good jobs, good terms and conditions, and that aligns with where the unions were, and we've always worked well together, and I think Gareth has been an excellent advocate for the steel industry across many years. So Gareth, would you like to address it?
Thank you, Roy, and thank you for inviting me to sit on this panel. I represent the employers. I represent the steel producers in the UK and a number of other re-rollers, steel companies. And, I sit on this panel and really I could just say, yeah, I agree. I agree with everything that's been said, and I support everything that's been said. And in terms of investment, 2 weeks ago, Johnny Reynolds, Secretary of State for Business, announced the biggest investment in our sector. And people said in a generation. It's not in a generation, it's in decades and decades, the biggest investment in our sector. So what I want to start off by saying is now, this time we're in, can be, and I hope in future years to come, look forward as the time when we changed the sector, when we started to believe that there was actually a brighter future for our sector rather than the ever-increasing slow decline of our sector. And what is there to go for? Rather than seeing this as a negative, let's see this as a positive. Steel demand in the UK, with a depressed economy, as Europe and globally depressed in terms of steel demand in the UK is about 8 million tonnes. We only supply now, at the moment, 32% of that 8 million tonnes. This time last year we supplied 40%. So every year it's getting worse and worse. Imports are increasing. Well, now's the time to change that. The sunny uplands are about grabbing more of that 8 million tonnes, more than 32% of it. And now we have a government that sets steel as a priority, that understands the issues that our government, that we as a sector faces, and, as I said 2 weeks ago, took decisive action to address the problems that we face with that massive investment. And we'd like to see more of that, and I hope that we will see a deal with British Steel in the future, in the short-term future. And we've got the National Wealth Fund, and Sarah mentioned £2.5 billion that needs to be invested in our sector. And I was really pleased when Secretary of State for Business made the announcement about Tata that he also talked about a steel strategy. And so all of my focus between now and the day that that steel strategy is published will be on doing what we can as UK Steel, as a small team, on what we can do to make that steel strategy better. And that, from my point of view, is working, and Roy just said this, it's working together with industry, and Sarah, you mentioned it, together with industry, trade unions and government and academics, all working together to look at, through a steel council, to look at how best to spend that money. Don't waste that money. This is a chance to really make a difference. So let's look at the capability of our sector, the capacity of our sector, and understand, as Roy said, future demand for steel, where it comes from. For example, theoretically, there's about 20 million tonnes of steel needed for offshore wind over the next 10 to 15 years. Well, how much of that have we supplied in the past for the offshore wind that we have? 0%. So look, there's 19 million tonnes that we could go and get if we and the trade unions and government had a plan and a vision to do that. We could go out and get that 19 million tonnes. So let's start by developing, from my point of view, I feel a steel council where we all work together and agree a shared vision and aim. And what government could start off, this is a cheap plug from my point of view, in terms of What government could do tomorrow is look at network charges on electricity prices and up the compensation from what is now 60% compensation on network charges to 90% on network charges. The government could announce that tomorrow. Perhaps they are going to announce that tomorrow. That's what I think we need to see straight off the back. So we need investment and we need a competitive business landscape for steel in the UK, because as Chris said, steel in a modern economy, everything is made of steel or made using steel. It is the most important material. Thank you.
I said I didn't always agree with Gareth. the issue for this, the underlying issue for us and the workforce is the impact on jobs. We're not dinosaurs, we don't bury our heads in the sand. We know steel making has to change and it has to, become green steel. We accept that. But it's the transition and it's the way we get to where we need to be that cannot mean that thousands of jobs are not just lost, but are, sort of thrown off the edge of a cliff in terms of the timescales that we now face. And I think the timescales are broadly financial in terms of what's happened over the last 12 months or more. It's not so much the fact that we know we've got to transition, it's the speed of that transition. And if we had more time and we had more planning and we had more thought to get us to where we need to be, we could have done that. I know we could have, with minimum job losses, with minimum redundancies. We could have protected everybody. And what is scary for all of us now is the speed of this transition, and it's not being driven by the environment, it's being driven by money, by finances. Steel businesses are seeing significant losses. We all heard the stories about how much, Tata, for example, and I think it's in the public domain so I can say it, Tata was saying, we're losing £1 million a day, and that's what's driven the change in reality, not necessarily the need to become greener. And I know a lot of steel workers, and I said we've got steel workers in the room today, feel very let down by this process, and they probably feel quite angry and bitter towards the process, that everything suddenly, where we thought we had 3 years, 4 years, 5 years to transition, that turns into, and by the way, the furnaces are going to shut by the end of the year, or even in Tata's case by the end of September. That was not, I'm going to repeat it, that was driven by finance, not by the need to green the steel industry. But that's kind of my thoughts and views. We'd like to hear your thoughts and views now. Stephen Kinnock was going to join us. He's not managed to get it yet. If he does join us, we'll invite him in and invite him to speak. In the meantime, Carwyn, you want to kick us off, sir?
Yeah, thank you, Roy. You and I worked together, of course, very closely in 2016 when I was First Minister, when there was last threat to the steel industry, when there was time to put their sites up for sale. They told us then they were losing £1 million a day.
Yeah.
And 8 years on, apparently they're still doing the same thing. But it strikes me that Tata then cared about the way they were perceived in a way that's no longer the case. But I do have a question for the panel, it's this. I've been in meetings where Tata have expressed strong scepticism about electric arc furnaces. I've heard them say it. And even those who take a different view have said to me, you could have an EAF there, but there would have to be a blast furnace alongside. The question I ask myself, the question I pose to the panel is, can we be sure that that electric furnace will actually be built?
Well, first off, I believe, and I may be shot down in flames, yes, on the easy part of the answer, yes, I do believe they're going to build the furnace. We've heard all the sort of scepticism and rumours that they're not really going to build the furnace, and that is not groundless. I mean, once the furnace is shut and they start to import steel from India and from their plant in the Netherlands, then there's a view I know of some of the workforce that, are they ever going to build this furnace? Is it all sort of a little bit of a scam that they really want to close down the heavy end and import steel from India. And we've just seen, I think this week they made an announcement that they just commissioned a massive big new blast furnace in India, taking them to, was it Alistair, my AGS is there and he's a bit of an expert, 20 million tonnes capacity now in India. So whilst they're closing our furnaces down on the basis of the environment, they're commissioning new capacity blast furnaces in India to the tune of 20 million tonnes. Now, I don't know where this environment stops at the border and says, oh, we can't go over there because they've greened. It's crazy. There has to be some form of global agreement on that. But maybe the other part of your question, Carwyn, will be best answered by Chris or by others. And yes, I believe they are going to build the furnace. I don't think that they're not going to build the furnace. The deal that they've struck with the government now that Jonathan Reynolds has secured is absolutely related to building the furnace. The money will not be released until certain stages of development of the furnace, and there are some, I think he said it in the statement, so I'm okay to say this, there are some clawback clauses that if they don't achieve those targets, then they won't get the grant funding that they've agreed with the government. But do you want to pick up that, Sarah?
I'll just add one thing to that. I mean, we're right to be, concerned about all of this. We have to be, and I think there is, as Roy says, the kind of clawback mechanisms in the agreement should help support the development. I think we also need to get the carbon border mechanism right, and that is something that the Treasury lead on, but that we're all feeding into, because that will secure us against the kind of importation of cheaper steel from China, and will protect the kind of investments as it will across Europe, protect investments in the EU or in the UK. So getting that right is a really important part of enabling a thriving community of steel production in the UK.
Chris, do you want to?
So thanks for the question, Carl. And I remember that time in 2016 as well. We were all very worried about it in the industry, and the efforts of you and the Welsh Government played no small part in making sure that we didn't see Port Talbot close in 6 weeks, as Tata had said at the time. In terms of the technologies, there is no alternative solution to an electric arc furnace in whatever scenario we have. There might be some new technologies in the future, but right now that's the only game in town. But as you've alluded to, an electric arc furnace on its own is only capable of recycling steel, which takes you a certain distance. But what we do need is primary steel making as well, and there needs to be a solution for that. Now, personally, I don't believe the blast furnace is the solution. There are the environmental concerns, but also there's no way to recover the cost of capital on a blast furnace nowadays. It's in the West, and its productivity isn't high enough. And that's why we're seeing the big steel players in Europe moving from blast furnaces to direct reduced iron technology. Most of them are taking as a first step so direct reduced iron technology exists, it's already a technology. So their first step is to move from blast furnaces to gas-based technology. That reduces your carbon emissions by 60%. So it's a great thing to do, and it's known technology. And then the final step after that would be hydrogen. That's not proven. There's one furnace in China that's operating at a high level of hydrogen, but not 100%. But that's the sort of technology path people are going down. I've got a lot of confidence in that route, but I also have some concerns as well, and my biggest concern is availability of raw materials. So currently only about 9% of global iron ore is suitable for DRI. If one or two companies in Europe make that change, that's fine. If everybody does, it's a big problem. But that's the technology route that we're all going down. So I've got confidence in electric arc furnaces, but we need to have the primary iron as well.
And one thing we need to remember when we talk about the transition from blast furnace to electric arc furnace in Europe, why are we doing it? Well, in the UK, for example, government wants us to do it, society wants us to do it, but actually much more importantly, our customers are demanding steel that's made in an electric arc furnace. And so if you think of sections, girders in buildings, we're rapidly losing market share in the UK because architects and designers want that steel to be made in an electric arc furnace because they believe it's green steel. And so therefore, until we can produce that steel as sections in the UK made from electric arc furnace, we will continue, unfortunately, to lose market share.
Any more questions? Go you first, sir.
Thank you. Ajay Lawalia, Head of Supply Chain at Renewable UK and Executive Committee Member of CIRA as well. Thank you to the panel discussing this very important topic. Just speak to what Gareth was saying with regards to the work and relevance to offshore wind. Just wanted to say that we are working with UK Steel to better identify what the link is of what offshore wind, particularly floating offshore wind, requires with regards to steel requirements. Would the panel like to talk about not just the production of raw steel or virgin steel, but also speak to the fabrication and manufacture of that into the key components that a net zero system requires, not just offshore wind, but perhaps the pylons or perhaps the road infrastructure, whatever it may be. Could the panel speak to that, please?
Yeah. We'll take a couple of questions and then, so there's two gentlemen there on that row. Yep.
So I'm a local councillor from Port Talbot, and a few familiar faces around the room. Some reflections from me, and then a question. You know, I represent the housing estate that was built to house the seat workers who built in the 1960s, and it is terrifying at the moment actually to see that community kind of in fear really of what's to come. And obviously the panel's spoken about the future industrial strategy we're developing, and I think I've got confidence that's going to prevent these situations in the future. But obviously what we're facing at the moment is very, very worrying in Port Talbot, and that cliff edge is coming, isn't it? And we've had people talk about wind turbines, and we've got a floating offshore wind project in Port Talbot, but that is not going to come online in time to deal with that gap. And I think we've got to remember, I think again it's been said in the panel, that this isn't a legacy industry. There's innovation, highly skilled jobs, even some of the lower skilled jobs. They're technical jobs, they're specialised jobs, and losing those is going to be really, really worrying. But to pick up Karen's point on the arc furnace, I'm sceptical, but I'm sceptical from the point of view of energy. And picked up the point about competitiveness, and the main competitive gap between us and Europe is energy costs. And the main issue with an electric arc furnace is it uses a lot of electricity. The one in Port Talbot will run 24/7, 365 peak time energy cost. I've not heard anything in the UK government announcements about meeting that. And I think the biggest risk to delivery from Tata's point of view is they're not going to invest that money until they have the energy assurances. So I'm wondering from the panel around that, particularly the politicians, about what we're doing to secure the commitments on energy, because I think that's the biggest risk to the project at the moment.
Thank you. I think if we're going to change to electric arc furnace, we also need to look at the supply chain with the scrap. 24 years ago, my company got a smart award from the government to have a technology demonstration where we could track the steel from birth to the end of its life by a simple digital identifier for the steel. So keep track of the steel over its life and then use it more intelligently at the end instead of chopping it up into little bits. This technology is still available. We've extended it since then, but we've not had any feedback or any partnership with the industry where we can develop it. So perhaps there's a time to look at the whole supply chain for the steel process, including the scrap industry, which is a very low-tech industry, which could be improved, I think, by modern technology.
Well, we'll go to the panel on those issues. I mean, what I'll say about, absolutely, this is devastating. This is not good news. This is not a celebration. The number of jobs that's going to come out of the industry in terms of Port Talbot, and we always say for every one direct job, there's three, maybe four in the supply chain. The transition board that was set up and is now being chaired by Joe Stevens identified, I think it was a couple of months ago, that the real figure is probably just short of 10,000. It's 9,000 plus jobs that are going to be lost in the area, with the contractors, in the supply chain, and all the other businesses that are connected to the steelworks. It's massive, and we get that. And the politicians now kind of need to step up to that challenge as well. I mean, we managed to secure, and I'm not here to celebrate anything, you've probably got that. You know, inwardly we're all devastated by what's happened here. We secured this 12-month training programme for people to try and transition into other employment, to get new skills. The key issue for that with me, and we've seen it in the industry elsewhere, is what are the jobs they're training for? You know, I always tell the story many years ago, decades ago, Corby, the heavy end of Corby, you know, closed, and I think we trained hundreds of chefs and lorry drivers, and you're like, where are the jobs? What jobs are we training people to do? Massive challenge, and the transition board really does have a role to play, as do the Welsh government and as do the local government as well. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens to the land. I know there's talk of, and I don't know what your view is of this free port, and is that going to bring in jobs? Is that going to bring in opportunities? But it is really challenging. I'll ask if the panel would like to comment on some of the other questions.
Shall I go? I mean, on the kind of wider question of supply chains and the steel strategy, the capacity and capability report that was last done in government was, I think, 2017?
No, 17,
2017.
Sorry, yeah.
So we need to look at, you know, what do we need, where is the demand, how do supply chains fit in with that, how do we reduce the barriers to the creation of steel, but then also the creation of things made from steel across the country, and to bring that up to grow it rather than reduce it. So I think getting the strategy right in terms of where the potential demand is and where the potential growth will be down the supply chain will be really important, and we need to look at all those things. I think when it comes to energy, you were talking about energy being something that you hadn't sort of heard much about. I mean, I think our argument on energy is really clear, and the argument is that we have been uniquely exposed in our cost of living crisis because we rely on fossil fuels and the international market. Energy produced in the UK, renewable clean energy, is cheaper, and therefore if you're looking at developing economic growth and the green transition, it makes sense to move as fast as we possibly can towards clean green energy in the UK. We will need, as you said, far more energy in the future for all of the things, from gigafactories to data centres to electric arc furnaces, so we have to move at pace. And there is, you can criticise, you could criticise things in terms of the new government, but one of the things that you absolutely can't is the speed with which Ed Miliband is dashing towards net zero in terms of breaking down barriers, creating new entities, moving at pace, and I think that will bring down fundamentally energy costs. But Gareth's point about energy costs in the short term is an important one. If you're looking at a strategy on steel, procurement and energy costs have got to be there, and we need to make sure as a new government that we're delivering on those kind of big thorny issues in the short term as well as the long term.
So what I'm going to do, mindful of time, I'm going to ask Gareth to speak a bit about the energy, because I know it's a passion, and I know it's something we've worked together with UK Steel on for some time now. It was one of the original 5 asks of government in terms of our lobbying together. And then there's a gentleman there who's wanted to ask a question, and so I'll take the question from you, sir, after Gareth has spoken on energy. And then the late Stephen Kinnock has arrived. Nice of you to join us, Stephen. It's a slightly important issue we're discussing here.
Wouldn't miss it for the world.
So I'll ask Stephen to address us after we've taken your question. But Gareth, do you want to just pick up the energy bit?
Thank you. And I'll be really quick because the Minister's just said, yes, it's the priority. Energy costs, energy supply and procurement, because we need to recognise that government is the single biggest purchaser of steel in the UK, and it only buys 60% of the steel it buys from the UK. So there's loads of improvement and opportunity can be there. So on energy costs, I talked about network charges, but also there's wholesale costs, which Sarah's just hinted at. And really all I'd say is 3 weeks ago, we published our annual electricity price disparity report, where we set out what we pay, what our competitors pay, and why there's a difference, what policies are in place that make it so we always pay more than France and Germany, which is 50% more than France at the moment, that we pay in the UK as steel producers. And then crucially, and it's on the Minister's desk, crucially, our report sets out these are the solutions. If you put these things in place, you will get the results that we will have competitive electricity prices here in the UK. And as you said, if we don't have competitive electricity prices here in the UK and we build these electric arc furnaces and all 6 steel producers in the UK produce steel via the electric arc furnace, they may as well be museums, because we'll still be uncompetitive and won't be able to compete, and we'll lose market share over time. And we don't want to lose market share, we want to gain market share.
Sir, do you want to?
Thanks, yeah. Steve Bills, I'm the Chief Executive of Freeport East, which is a Freeport on the East Anglian coast. And like Ajay, kind of focused on how we get more steel used in the offshore wind sector. I was just kind of curious, I think that the numbers around how much of our own market we're not taking advantage of is pretty shocking. As ever in these big strategic sectors, government itself is an enormous procurer, directly or indirectly, of steel. I think, so you touched on it a little bit, but I guess just to go a little bit further in terms of the role for government in not just as we're trying to get the pricing right, but actually from the top down in terms of this procurement side, how we can kind of use government procurement in all its forms to kind of make more of our own industry.
Just on that point, I remember when Tata came in and took over what was then Chorus, and it was Mr. Muttaraman, who was one of the senior directors at that time, and during his first visit to the UK, we thought he was brilliant because he was singing off the same hymn sheet as us. He absolutely panned the market share in the UK, and at that time it was 60%. We had a 60% market share, and the first time he addressed the unions, he said, "That's terrible. It's nowhere near high enough. We should be more ambitious. We should be getting more market share of the UK market." And look where we are now. What on earth? It's unsustainable, and you're absolutely right. Terrible, shocking to think that we import so much steel when our industry is on its knees. Stephen, I don't know whether you want to come in and address us and pick up the question, because that would be helpful. Sure. If you could.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roy, and apologies for
you could use the lectern microphone, perhaps. Pull it down.
Does that work?
Oh, that's closer to you.
Yeah, does that work? Okay.
There you go.
Here we are. Thank you very much, Roy, and apologies again for being late. Obviously, having not heard what all the panel said, I can't comment with any real detail, but looking at who's on the panel, I'm pretty sure that I can say that I agree with every word that was being said. Look, the Port Steelworks is the beating heart of our economy and our community. There isn't a single family in Port Talbot that isn't connected to that steelworks, and it plays an absolutely crucial role not just in our local economy and our community, but also in terms of our country's national security and in our ability to make the most of the huge changes that are coming down the road in terms of the green industrial revolution. It's about as well those well-paid jobs which are not that easy to come by in our part of the world. So it is an absolutely vital strategic industry, and I'd like to pay tribute to Community Union and the steel unions, and to Sarah and the government for moving so quickly. We know it's a difficult situation, but I do genuinely believe that we've achieved more in the 6 weeks or so, or 8 weeks, or whatever it is, since we got elected, than the last lot did in 14 years. So let's be clear that we are absolutely putting steel at the heart of our agenda. To the gentleman's point specifically about this opportunity around floating offshore wind, we have this huge opportunity in the Celtic Sea for the kind of investment, we're talking billions, we're talking tens of thousands of jobs. For me, the biggest challenge is around making sure that we've rolled the pitch for it. So are we investing in the port infrastructure
to make it happen? Are we getting the supply chains up and running to ensure that the manufacturing and the assembly and the integration of those huge floating structures and substructures are happening in South Wales and in the UK? And thirdly, on skills, are we actually developing the skills pipeline that we need to ensure that we capture all the benefits? I was told the other day that the French government is investing a lot of money in the port of Brest with a view to becoming a competitor on floating offshore wind. We know the Irish are also investing, so we have to make sure that we develop and deliver plans for skills, port infrastructure and supply chain to ensure that we can maximise those opportunities, because I think it's clear that when you look at previous generations of onshore and offshore wind, we simply haven't turned those opportunities into manufacturing jobs for our communities. So it is a huge opportunity, but it really needs a coordinated plan with all of us pulling together, UK government, Welsh government, local authorities, local providers of services, the local skills and education sector, so that we can develop and be ready, so that when those developers win those auctions, which are going to be announced in the spring of next year, the first place they look at is South Wales to develop all of the infrastructure that's required, and also, of course, the steel, because those substructures, if they are going to be made with steel, that's a huge opportunity for that steel to be made in Wales or in the UK. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we might have time for one last question. There's two hands gone up there. Do we take you? Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Claire Besford, the Cabinet Member for Environment and Transport at Stockton on Tees Borough Council. And I wanted to ask, you mentioned, Chris, around future-proofing technologies and truly green steel. Is how are those technologies don't yet exist? Are they on the horizon? Do you know anybody? And how well placed is UK Steel to be involved in an R&D project around that? Thank you.
Excellent question. I'm going to go straight to Chris.
Thanks, Claire. So we are quite fortunate in that we have very strong R&D capability in the UK, spread around the UK. My own institute, I used to run the Steel and Metals Innovation Centre in South Wales as well, many other institutes. But at the moment we're not really taking advantage of that. So governments in the past have been happy to invest in innovation, but really innovation is of no value unless it's implemented in a factory, and then you get real economic return from it. So yes, I mean, I mentioned this issue, for instance, of the lack of availability of suitable raw materials for DRI. We used to face that problem with blast furnaces as well, but over many decades we incrementally improved the capability of our blast furnaces to use low-grade ores. I know we could apply those same techniques in DRI and create a competitive advantage for steel in the UK. But we can only do it if we get a set of government policies that create a business environment that enables us to invest. And that's what I hope to see from our steel strategy when that's published next year.
We are running out of time, but this gentleman here has been wanting to ask a question, so we'll take... This is the last question, and then we'll have to wrap up. Has he got a microphone? So no pressure, this is going to be an excellent question.
I'm not asking this question as a Labour Party member or anyone associated with the Labour Party, but I'm asking this question as a son of a Teesside steel worker. I appreciate we've heard quite a bit about Talbot's South Wales, but my question really to the panel, do you believe that this Labour government's industrial strategy runs through the beating heart of Teesside?
Yeah. I can understand where that question comes from, because obviously I was around at the time when Teesside Steelworks closed, and that was the biggest act of industrial vandalism I've ever known. And I think we spoke the other night at our function, and I know Teesside could have been saved for the sake of £20 million, which when you're talking about now 2.5 billion and 3 billion and 500 million, it seems like nothing. And that's how terrible the decision to allow Teesside Steelworks to go. And look at the site now and look at what has happened to that site. It's an absolute disgrace. So I absolutely understand the question. I don't know whether Chris again might be the best person to pick that up, or Sarah, do you want to?
Should I just from a kind of government point of view, I mean, obviously the conversations with British Steel are ongoing and the situation is very difficult, and everybody, I think, understands that, and what we've inherited in terms of the situation that we're in is hard. I can't comment on where those conversations have got to because they're commercially confidential. The thing with our industrial strategy that will be different to the attempts that Theresa May had at developing an industrial strategy, well, there will be many differences. But one of them is we're looking at the kind of sectors that we know we're already strong in and we can develop and we can grow, and the sectors that we need to develop for our own national security. But then we're looking at place very carefully. Where are the areas that we need to develop? Where do we need to get more investment? What are the levers we can pull? Now, we know that the previous government had the kind of free ports and different models. We are, through our National Wealth Fund, co-investing through Great British Energy, co-investing alongside the private sector, trying to break down those barriers when it comes to, for example, grid capacity, which is a huge issue in Scunthorpe, how we get that grid capacity quicker, how we break down kind of planning consent and speed those things up. Where there are barriers, we are trying to break them down, and where there is investment potential, we are trying to co-invest as a government, so to be that kind of strategic government, being active, being nimble, being agile. So I would say yes is the answer to your question, and we need to work with local authorities, with mayors, with all of the structures that we're empowering through greater devolution to get that right.
We really must wrap up. We're getting some abusive hand signals from the back. We've overstayed our welcome, I think. But can I just thank all of the panel for everything that they've contributed, all of you for coming along and showing an interest. Hopefully this will stimulate some further conversations outside a conference, and we can all work together for that brighter future for our steel industry and our steel workers. So thank you very much for the time.